My sister-in-law used to work at a veterinary clinic, and she was always, her boss always used to say she was a treasure, and she thought that was in lieu of pay. So always a little bit leery of that word, but I think I should just be gracious and say thank you. I think it's the hair and the wisdom that presumably comes with it. My talk is on the ICT and the Australian curriculum, largely because Trudy asked me to talk on that, and it was with some trepidation I think I accepted the opportunity to come and speak, largely because I'm not an insider in this. I'm not on the... Wrecked already. So much for being a treasure. Help. Oh, it'll find me. That's good to know. I don't fret. I refuse to fret about machines. Okay. As I was saying, I'm not an insider. There's possibly people in this room who know more about this and where this is up to than I do, but I've had a fair crack at trying to penetrate the kinds of documents we've seen in public places. I've rung a few people, I've been harassing people and fretting over this since Trudy asked me to talk to this topic, and I'm hoping that what I present today is as close as we can get to what we know at the moment. I was interested to hear some people earlier today say that you're already teaching the Australian curriculum, the learning areas that we have in our Phase 1 iteration of that, and you're starting to come to terms with not only where ICT sits in that, but how those particular learning areas fit together and what's required of them. Our lead does come from the Melbourne Declaration, and I like the way Tom said it was ammunition, because it certainly has been for me in my workplace in making things happen in teacher education. Similarly with the previous declarations, Hobart and Adelaide, that really had a lot to say about technologies, particularly information and communication technologies. But the Melbourne Declaration, there's something about the way it's crafted. It really has looked seriously and sensibly at the whole notion of 21st century learning. And I think there may be some subtleties in there that might be missed if we let them be missed. And I think the challenge of this keynote to you is going to be not to let them be missed, to actually grab what we know works, what we want to do, and to put that in place in terms of the new curriculum. Probably because of my age, I recall reading back in 1986, a man called Sendov said, "How do we build education in the presence of the computer?" Now those words have stuck with me. What we mean by the word computer has changed, but the question hasn't gone away. How do we build education in the presence of the computer? And we rethink what the word computer means. The ACCE, the Australian Council for Computers in Education, the parent body, if you will, of KEGSA, this year produced a response to ICT in the Australian curriculum, to the ACARA documents, and they said that the challenge now is to determine ICT's conceptual home and its content. And that's where we are, folks, determining our conceptual home. And it means we've got to think really hard about what we think ICT is and what we think it can bring to learning. So let's move on. I've decided to call this context and content. Some people think they're impossible bedfellows, and I've had almost stand-up blues with some of my primary school colleagues because sorry, you probably stopped thinking I'm a treasure, but I did teach in secondary school. I actually started off teaching art and history and ended up running the computer department, but that's the way things work. So context and content are seen sometimes as diametric opposites, as almost enemies, that they can't exist in the same universe. A colleague of mine is part of the improbably named LARC group in Queensland, Learning Area something or other committee, reference committee, and there was someone on that committee, the Technologies LARC, that said, if you've got ICT as a general capability, you don't need it as a standalone subject. They can't see that they can exist in the same atmosphere, the same environment. They're going to suck each other's oxygen. They're not going to exist in the same space. Well, that's, I don't think, is right. And hopefully in the next hour I'll convince you of that as well. But let's away. I'm doing this as a prezi, so those with epilepsy, you might think to move now. Right, we're looking at context, we're looking at content. I have put this up online. If you go to prezi.com and search on ICT in the Australian curriculum, you can find it. You can also download it because I've made it available to share. We'll start with context. If anything, the general ICT as a general capability in the Australian curriculum is talking to ICT as context. It is going to permeate, and that's probably the right word to use, all of the learning areas in some way, shape and form. And it's up to us, as I said, to make sure that that's sensible and there's some kind of synergies between the way it appears, the way it works in one subject area to another. This is what I think it means. This photograph is a collage from a new project in New South Wales called SEE, which is Schools Exploring in the Environment. And what do you see? You see powerful, portable technologies in kids' hands. And those kids are interacting directly with their environment. They're testing water temperature, they're probably counting water fleas in the water, they're taking photographs, they're documenting in the field. They're coming back into the classroom to analyse what they've found. This, to me, is ICT as context. This is what we used to call, when we didn't have other kinds of language, learning with technology. It's where the content area, the learning area, is the key. We're learning with it. We have to learn incidentally about how to use the equipment and devices along the way, but the science or the English or the history is the predominant learning experience. And the neat things you've seen over in the trade hall, those lovely toys, the microscopes and so on, fit beautifully into that paradigm. The other thing we used to talk about was learning through technology. And the C part of ICT has made that come home to us with a passion. And these images are from a Year 7 class in Victoria, Anne Merchant, who those of you who are on Oz Teachers will know her name. She's a regular contributor to that forum. This is her class, and it's in rural Victoria. They had their music lessons talking about the instruments of the orchestra with a musician from the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, and they used Illuminate. So it was real time, real musician talking to kids in a little country school. Lovely stuff. Nice immediate experience of learning through the technology. This is context. This for me is context. When we come to the general capabilities, we start to see the way that this is imagined. Learning as context is imagined in the new curriculum. And this is where I start to fret, because I've got a horrible feeling this is not going to work for me. See, you should always listen to your horrible feelings sometimes. I wanted to go to that side. I'll try again. Okay. Hearts in mouths. Stop the tape. You'll start to see what I've been searching on. It's so personal looking at somebody else's screen. Here we go. And I'll have to reduce it, which will muck everything else up. The general capabilities are, it's an eye chart. What were you saying about 2020 before, Tom? Right. The general capabilities, for those who haven't memorised them, are literacy, numeracy, information and communication technology competence, and we'll fret about that word in a moment, critical and creative thinking, ethical behaviour, personal and social competence and intercultural understanding. And I immediately thought, well, doesn't ICT do all of those things? But then I thought if I did that, we'll wipe ourselves off the map. If you then follow this link to what it says ICT competence is, and I've got to do another little bit of fussing, and I should have let Ralph let me do that. The components of ICT competence are these 5 things. Investigate with ICT, create with ICT, communicate with ICT, operate ICT, and lastly, apply appropriate social and ethical protocols and practices to operate and manage ICT. Now, there will be a quiz. You have to remember those. Investigate, create, communicate, operate, and behave socially and ethically correctly. If you go down into the rationale, it's quite interesting. Some of the language there, and I don't expect you to read it all particularly from that distance, but if you could just skim it and start to see some of the key words and understandings from within that. It starts off a bit permeating every area of our society and lives. They need to be equipped with necessary knowledge and skills to use ICT to support contemporary learning. Well, that's okay, I suppose. But then in the next paragraph, particularly the second line down, it starts to say some interesting things about problem solving, decision making, communicating, creative expression and empirical reasoning. And the next little sentence uses what for me is the magic word, transforming. Now, when I saw that first list about investigating, creating, communicating, operating and being ethical, I wondered where transformation was. But then I tend to be a little bit cynical. Certainly may be there, but it might not as well. So with that in mind, we'll try and go back to where we were before. Somebody loves me at work. Now let's fret about ICT competence. Now the ACCE paper of this year didn't seem to have any problem with the word competence. I worry a little because it's a competence inside a capability, and I'm not quite sure if that's the hierarchy or if it's a lesser thing or a greater thing or how that actually fits. ACCE decided to look at the European qualifications framework where competence sits quite highly in the scheme of things. And they weren't unhappy with that. But that word worries me a little bit. When you look at, go beyond that particular site I took you to, the Australian curriculum site, if you were part of the consultation, it actually expanded what they meant by the general capabilities a little bit more. Now, this closed last weekend, and I'm hoping that some of you were able to make comment to that. It's one good thing about this curriculum, there are plenty of opportunities for making public comment. And there was more information in the consultation documents than there were in the standalone or major site of the Australian curriculum. And this is how they've represented those 5 things. Now, I don't know if my old hippie days went straight away to it's an old peace sign or it was something with Mercedes-Benz if I'm a new capitalist days, I'm not quite sure. But they've shifted those around and they've done it in a relatively interesting way in that managing and operating is the outside rim and applying social and ethical, and that's probably sensible because they're sort of processy things, they're the way we make things happen, they're fairly, they're sort of threshold behaviours, if you like, to make the other things happen. And there they've got investigating, creating and communicating within the inside of that particular circle. Now compare that, please, to... Oh, where did I go? I went the wrong way. Let me move this one way again. Didn't go where I wanted it to go. I've missed something, I apologise. This was my bit about competence that I was worried about. See, I'm not a treasure. Ralph lied to you, that's all. I need to go back to my man with the hammer. The word competence, this is what it means to me. Somebody who can do something. Now, whether I've got that from that use of that word associated with vet qualifications is probably where it's come from. To me, a competence is very much a point-in-time thing. Back in 2002, when Nata Phelps from Southern Cross University in New South Wales wrote, competence is akin to the notion of proficiency, which is a construct that is demonstrated at a particular point in time and as such is insufficient to ensure sound, continued integration of technology into teaching practice or to support notions of lifelong learning. So she was worried about it then. I chose this photo quite deliberately because to me it was like Maslow's theory that if all you've got's a hammer, the world looks like a nail. And I'll come back to that idea in a moment. Hopefully I'll go the right way this time. Yes, in our world of ICT competence, there also exists something called ICT literacies. Now, in Australia at the moment, we have had ICT literacy testing, national testing, in 2005, 2008, and this year it's going to happen again, and this year it's under the NAP banner. So it's NAP ICT. Now, some heads are nodding, so you know this is coming. It might be coming to a school very near to you. It now sits under the NAP banner, the National Assessment Program banner. It exists. There is an ICT literacy domain which looks like this. Now, it's not Mercedes-Benz, it's not a hubcap. This time it looks like, a life-saving device, a life buoy. And we've got a different set of things. Now, these things are coexisting in the one universe. Now, something's got to give. If you try and look at these two together, they don't quite match. They don't quite match. There is something about the social and ethical there. If you have a look at this, there's a strand which says using ICT responsibly. I suppose that's ethical. Using ICT appropriately, not using your iPad to hit somebody over the head. You know, these are the things that matter. With managing and operating, because you had to remember those from before, here we've got an odd little thing called managing information. Now, I'm not quite sure if managing information and managing ICT and operating ICT are the same thing. I think they are not. Maybe that sits under working with information. Communicating got a Guernsey in both. In the ICT general capability, it talks about investigating. That word isn't mentioned here, but there's things that are in and around that. Accessing information, perhaps evaluating, perhaps developing new understandings. And then you start to wonder, well, why aren't neat words like evaluating and understanding in the new one? Why aren't they there? Where have they been hidden? What have they been sublimated into? I don't know if they're the same. We've got creating with ICT. Here we've got creating and sharing information. Now, this one I was critical of because of its incredible focus on information. And that's another word that worries me. See, this is why I'm great. I worry about words. I lay awake at night and think, what does competence mean? What does information mean? And isn't information something that somebody else has figured out? It's not those kids down in the creek. They're getting data. And it'll become information. It'll become knowledge. But it doesn't start out as information. It doesn't start out as something cold and dry out of a book. It's something they have worked towards, they have fashioned it, they have manipulated it into. If you've seen the way these tests run, you'll see the cause for my concern. But that's probably another keynote for another day. We'll move along. They're not the same. And then I think before I leave this, we probably need to look at both. We'll go back to the other one. Look at both in terms of what Tom was talking about this morning, even that lovely look to learn focus, where you're using the technologies to inculcate empathy with your world, to think about all sorts of things, from social justice to, a visual aesthetic. All sorts of things. They're hinted at, but they're not there. And that being hinted at, is what worries me a little bit. Now let's have a look at how this is going to be assessed. In the consultation document, they provided a rubric, and the assessment was at years 2, 6 and 10. That was all. In some of the capabilities, there were more key points, if that's the correct term to use, but the expectations were that by the end of year 6, this is what kids could do when it came to creating with ICT. First one, students use ICT to effectively record ideas, represent their thinking and plan solutions. Sounds okay. Next one, create solutions independently or collaboratively for particular audiences and purposes, and use a range of software types and functions to edit a range of data types such as text, images, still and moving, audio and numbers. It's okay, but it's sort of soulless, isn't it? Keep thinking about those kids down at the creek again with all that neat gear. Although that probably isn't creating, that's probably more investigating. And if you have just listen for a moment to what they say investigating with ICT at the end of year 6 should be. It says students use appropriate ICT I don't know what inappropriate ICT is, to identify and represent patterns in sets of information and to pose questions. Sets of information, again a presumption it's already existing. They plan, locate using search engines and basic search functions. There's no mud or water involved. Retrieve and organise information in meaningful ways and assess the suitability of information using appropriate criteria. I start to worry again that we're talking about a particular world. You know, we've got a hammer here, guys. We've got a hammer, and it's not the kind of world we're thinking about. Now, I've had cause in my millions of years of operation in this field to be concerned the way things are interpreted. As recently as 2005, I visited a primary school where I was very, very proudly shown the school's scope and sequence document. And, hand on my heart, because I am known to exaggerate, hand on my heart, what this document said was in Year 5, kids could use bold and italics. In Year 6, they could underline, and in Year 7, they could create tables. Guess which piece of software they were using? And it was only one too. The whole world, all of ICT was word processing. And then when I went back and read this, that scarred me deeply. And when I read this, I thought, well, that particular teacher, who is still out there teaching, could read that and be justified. They could say, yeah, that's okay. My kids are using text. I might let them put images in. They can type numbers. That'll fit. And then that feeling got even worse when I started shifting this into the curriculum. Another big C. This is a bit like Sesame Street. You've got all these letters had. I, C and T. In the literacy strand in English, look at the second one. My teacher with his scope and sequence document would feel justified with this. Use a range of software. Well, I suppose you can have a range of one, including word processing programs, learning new functions. Well, in 1 year they learn bold and italics, next year they learn underline. Woe betide, you precocious little creatures who want to use a table. Woe betide. But as required, right? So you're not required. You know, don't get ahead of yourself. You can build a table when you're 12. You know, don't worry about it. And then you think, oh, again, hammers and nails. This worries me. I worry about the over-prescription of bold and italics. I worry about something that can be read in such a way that it can mean prescription of that kind. And this is where I said our challenge is. This is where we've got to find our conceptual home. We've got to decide what we value, what we mean to continue with. So when you read these and say, yeah, I know what that means. Yeah, you know what that means because you're the kind of folks who are here. You're the kind of folks who are over there playing with the whiteboards and the toys and the Beetlebots and all the rest of it. You're here. But think about some of your colleagues who may be thinking with a hammer instead of their heads. That's the model. And this is me as a young woman. No. I actually learned to type on something like that. It was an old Imperial. But this is what I worry about, is this ICT. It's not, a computer is not a typewriter. It's all about metaphors for me. It's where you think, where you imagine the technology to sit, what you imagine the technology to be. So ICT is context. Is it a fluency? Is it a literacy? Is it word processing? Now, I know that's a long quote to put up, but it was quite poetic and I didn't want to lose it. Comes from 3 authors in 2008. I'm not going to read it all, but I'll leave you a moment to read through it. I'm particularly taken with the second sentence. This conception recognises the synergy between the individual and the technology and the adaptive capacity of the individual to manage and survive in a digital environment. If you pick up those first words I picked out of the ICT rationale: transforming, risk-taking, knowledge sharing. That's the kind of person that I think they were talking about. When you start putting something like that into standards, when you start turning it into something prescriptive, then we start to have some problems. Because with the best of intentions, things are going to be misinterpreted. I mean, the term digital fluency, I think, is kind of nice. And maybe rather than fretting over ICT competence over ICT literacy, maybe we pick another word altogether. This is where we were heading. This is the kind of person that Tom was talking about this morning. This is the kind of person that's described by 21st century learning. The kind of person who, you know, heaven forbid if there's ever a word processor that you can't underline with, you know, you have to be able to think, to adapt, to shift, to change, to use technology when and where it's needed. And that's, I think, what we're after. If we can distill that into our ICT as a general capability, then we'll be doing very, very well indeed. We're going to move on to the other part of this now, onto some content. Oh, no, we're not. We're going to go to content via technology, via the letter T. This section's brought to you by the letter T. And here, I think, is the nub of the problem, or the nub of the issue, and that is in working out what we mean by technology. And this is where my stand-up blue with my primary colleagues came about, in that they were talking about all these lovely applications, particularly in creating animations that kids could use. And they said, you secondary people, you're teaching programming and all that rubbish, what do you want that for? And then you have to quietly say, well, who do you think developed the animation program? Did that just sort of blossom somewhere? Is there an animation program tree? You know, is there an app garden that you just go and get them from? Somebody wrote that, somebody built it, somebody tested it. You know, it's what you imagine technology to be. Are you a designer? Are you a user? And then if you're a user, are you a user of open-ended software? Not open source, that's something different. Open-ended software that allows you in turn to be creative in different kinds of ways. So it got to this, that we were looking at the same thing but seeing it very, very differently. And that cartoon comes from Grady Boocher's book, and Grady Boocher is one of the most respected software programmer and engineers in the world. And this is the way he illustrates his books, in these really creative, crazy sorts of ways in how you analyse object-oriented information and programs. We were looking at the one thing, but looking at it with very different eyes. Both are correct, and both have a place. I like that picture. I like it to the point I think I'm starting to look rather like the ladies, so I definitely need to move on. Now we'll move to content. Because once you've established that, you've said the context is beautiful, and no one's going to argue with that, but the content is bound to be the loser in this. Context is going to be the winner. Context is going to be the winner because for a long, long time, KEGSA and all the other professional associations in Australia have been trying to, and I did this because I drew it with my hands, we've been trying to move ICT from the periphery into the mainstream. That's what we've been trying to do for a very long time. And ICT is a general capability, irrespective of what we call it, that's what it's going to be. So that's a win. That's a big win, and it's a space that you have rightly deserved. So cheer that one, that's a good one to keep. ICT as content, though, is something we have had, particularly in senior secondary, and it stands to be the loser in all of this, but I shall continue. Let's go to that ACCE paper I was talking about before, their position paper on this. They're arguing for both content and context, and I must admit I belong to that particular camp as well. They said there's a body of knowledge associated with ICT that is not covered in other learning areas. Typically focuses on characteristics of data, people, procedures and electronic equipment and how they interact to create structured information. This knowledge and these skills form the educational career pathways to supporting the digital economy. Very, very different world to the kids in the creek. Very different world to the kids talking to the musician through Illuminate, but as valid. And furthermore, this is from the British Computing Society. It says, computing allows pupils to solve problems, design systems, and understand the power and limits of human and machine intelligence. Pupils who can think computationally are better able to conceptualise and understand computer-based technology, and so are better equipped to function in modern society. I think they don't have a lot of evidence for that last bit, but it sounds good. They probably have curlier hair and straighter teeth as well. But it's nice to think this. And when I used to teach programming on probably the worst computers, least powerful computers the world has ever seen, I used to think about it as problem solving. I mean, the problem was, were they going to work that day? But no, it was all about problem solving. I could see that very few of my students were going to go on and become programmers. It wasn't a vocational course. But we were there and we were working things out, and it was high-level problem solving. And I will argue until I'm 6 feet under, that it's a very, very good way of doing that. There's better ways of doing it. The programming tools have improved. We've got lovely things like Alice and Scratch and things of that nature that you would go to now rather than C or Pascal for kids, because that's child abuse. But what this leads us into, it's not teaching with, it's not teaching through, it's teaching about, and unashamedly teaching about. Of course you've got to teach about when you're teaching with and through, but that's not the main purpose, and it's fundamentally and conceptually different, and it deserves a place as well. And Trudy will attest to this. I had to be dragged out of this place. On the recent ACCE study tour, I think Ralph was probably there as well when I had to be dragged out, we visited a place called the Computer History Museum in Mountain View in California. And it was just wonderful. They had every machine ever, and they had an exhibition there called Revolution, the first 2,000 years of computing. And they had Napier's bones and a Pascaline machine, and it was just lovely. I was just so happy. They even had the original rack and am I allowed to say crappy on film? Crappy old PCs that how Google started. They just had the most wonderful, wonderful things in place. And it just reminded me that what this argument I keep having with people about we have to teach about as well was justified. This was, to me, what the whole thing was about. That this place was a testament to human ingenuity, right back from centuries ago to the present day. And it was interesting, you could see, because there was a range of ages on the trip, and people would tend to pick up this journey from what they first knew. So the Gen Ys were there Googling over gooing over the Commodore 64s or what they had as children, and they would pick up the journey from where they came in. Some of the older folks were interested in the war, World War II developments and so on, the big machines. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful thing. But the thing that really got me was this. They have rebuilt Charles Babbage's analytic engine. And at 1:30 every day, and we left at 12:30, I was very sad. At 1:30 every day, they run it, and it works. Babbage never saw it. Babbage never saw it. So because I did get through
every turn of the engine's driving handle is carried through gears, hammers, rods, levers, and springs to release and arrest precisely aligned number wheels. The helical arrangement of steel fingers continually pulls the register towers to find and perform the carrying of tens. In its continuing sweep upward, it is mesmerizing.
And I'm a
intricate
Doctor Who
printing
fan,
section
so
can
I'm
be
sure this is in
programmed
the
for 1,
TARDIS.
2, or 3 column output.
Just
With
love
2
it. It's all
font sizes
polished
at
wood
once.
and
For
brass.
variable
And,
margins and column gaps, even word wrap where necessary. In the spring of 2008, a clone of DE2 commissioned by Nathan Myhrvold was completed at the Science Museum and shipped to California. At the Computer History Museum, it would charm new thousands of discerning eyes. Today, the crotchety proud genius, who never managed to prove it during his lifetime, has a fair claim to honor as a pioneer in the history of intelligent machines, just as his parlor guests in 1832 suggested. His difference engine continues to inspire the admiration of his intellectual heirs, a celebrated and unique icon, the chroniclers of computing. Charles Babbage, remember, never saw it, except in his stubborn, prescient dreams.
it's a lovely thing. Weighs 11 tonnes. I'm sure I could take one home. There's only 2 in the world. Babbage never built it, but Babbage planned it, Babbage dreamed it. And for me, seeing this was justification that there's this whole other body of knowledge that's a combination of engineering, mathematics and computational science that deserves a place in our curriculum. It's a lovely thing. And I'm sure we can get kids, you know, to build a Babbage machine. I'm quite convinced of it. Go back to where we are. I'm sorry, that was totally and utterly indulgent. As I said, we've got teaching ICT as content in our schools already, and yes, that is the Titanic. A colleague of mine argued with me that it was the Lusitania, and I thought, oh dear. But it is the Titanic, I'm sure of it. We are teaching ICT as content in our senior secondary schools, and I have to say this with some sadness, because up until recently I was the State Review Panel Chair for Information Processing and Technology in Queensland with about 600 students every year. We are, in South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria, I haven't got figures from other places, losing our kids in that space. The subjects that we offer there are not appealing to kids. We are losing numbers dramatically in all of those states. More damning, they aren't doing very well at it. In Queensland, we have 2 senior secondary subjects, Information Processing and Technology, and something called Information Technology Systems. Now, we're not allowed to use another F word, fail, but the ones that don't pass, not fail, don't do very well. 25 to 30%. You know, that's too many. Way too many. Way too many kids. They're starting these courses and they're simply not getting through them. So there's an awful lot of heartache and disappointment along the way. In its heyday, we had about 5,000 students doing this subject, so we were roping people in. You know, anyone who could recognise a computer from their elbow suddenly found themselves teaching senior computing. Not a good way to proceed the subject or proceed the course. I mean, you know, Babbage might have survived in a course like that, but not many other kids do. We are in a mess. So, you know, I don't really like that phrase about every problem is an opportunity and all this sort of thing, but I think in this instance it's true. If we think ICT as content exists in our schools, we've got to lift our game. We've got to think about what is working, what's going to appeal to kids, what's going to have sensible outcomes for them in this space. And we have to rewrite what we now call senior computing nationally and think about where it's going to be and what it's going to do for these kids. Or it's all going to be the Titanic. They're all going to go down in the screaming heap. It's not a good look, and it's a space that it's hard to defend. I'm saying that ICT's content is probably going to be the loser in this, but if we don't lift our games, as much as it's dear to me, I think it probably deserves to go if it's not going to meet the needs of our students. All right. I was going to take you out now, and here I again live in hope. I think this one's going, see, some of the links were working, some weren't. It's a mystery to me. All right, where this is up to now, we have had the word that we are going to be part of a technologies, plural, learning area. And this does come from the Melbourne Declaration. At the moment, it's given the improbably long name of Information and Communication Technology and Design and Technology. And by the time you've written that in the kids' report card, there'll be nothing left to write. That's what the area is being called. Now, when this went up and when I started to prepare this, the panel, this Technologies Learning Advisory Panel, was supposed to meet at the end of July. It only just found, some people only found out this week that they are on that panel, and it's now going to meet at the end of August. The lead writer has still not been named, so I was hoping someone's mobile phone might go off and one of you might get the word right now that that's your Guernsey for the next couple of years. It's going to be a hotly contested space. We went through this in Queensland. I was part of a team with the Queensland Studies Authority trying to write a junior subject called Information and Communication Technology Education. At one point, the technology lobby, and I do have to call them that, fought to take the word technology off us. For a while, we were just going to be called Information and Communication Education. I think I used the words over my dead body, and that seemed to work. Next time I used it, because that's a card you can't play too often. The second time, one of the managers of QSA said, that could be regrettable, but it could be arranged. So I thought, ooh, better not play the dead body card again. But it was nonsense. How could you say your subject was called Information and Communication? What subject isn't? You know, ancient Sanskrit is probably information and communication. You know, they're all information and communication. And industrial technology, however, was allowed to keep the big T technology word because industrial was an adjective and you couldn't just call a subject industrial. And I thought, really? And then I went on to this I wrote pages. Information and communication were describing words. They weren't perhaps adjectives as such, but it was a descriptive phrase and therefore equated to industrial. But anyway, that's another story for another day. So those people who are on that committee, I wish you well, because it will be a hotly contested space. And you will be surprised how tough the home economics ladies are. Don't worry about that. What they can do with the crochet hook. Yeah, you just have to... And this is being filmed. Why am I saying this? But the silly thing is, they all deserve their space. They all deserve their place in the sun. There is genuine arguments for all of these things. But they're not the same. You know, a group called the Technology Education Network published some material last year where instead of a sort of a technology literacy, they came up with this word called technacy, which sounds like something you need to go to the chemist about. I've got a bad case of technacy. And they described it as an ability to explore a context and its parameters and set goals to achieve a purposeful outcome using a synthesis of human capacity, brackets, knowledge, techniques and social systems, close brackets, technical objects and systems to transform existing virtual and or physical resources. Now, does anyone understand what that means, and could they meet me outside later and explain it? Because it doesn't really say very much. Or, more to the point, it has a little KGB disinformation thing wrapped around it, in that it sounds right, you know, it sounds like it fits ICT, but if you look a little bit harder at it, you see it doesn't. And if you hark back to that digital fluency quote that I made you all read, and I will be testing you on, it's not the same. It is just not the same. They are chalk and cheese. They appear to be using the same language, but they are not. So while technologies as an umbrella sound sensible, it really isn't. I think we can kind of make it work up to grade 10s, sharing the ICT and design space, but I don't think we can share that space in senior. But that's, as I said, another conversation for another day, and it's one that's going to unfold. Now, I probably need to get back to that notion of where I started. We've got to decide what our conceptual home is. We've got to decide what we're going to defend. We've got to decide if ICT is a general capability, and for the techies amongst us, I've put in a logic gate for you, and or not an ICT learning area. Where does it fit? And in each of those spaces, what is it going to look like? I mean, it's not as simple as context and content. It really isn't that simple. General capability, as I tried to point out in a fairly ham-fisted way, I think, you can read anything you will into that, and we might find some of the worst, not even 20th, but 19th century practices wrapped into that. We need to take some care of the words. We need to take care of the intent of the words. When it comes to the ICT learning area, it needs a shake-up. You know, it is the Titanic. It needs a shake-up, it needs redesign, and it needs a careful hand. But they can both exist in the same universe, because I think they're parts of the same story, but they're very different parts of the same story. They're discrete, but they belong to the same universe. And then I had to get the letter I in. So what do I think? Well, I've been ranting on about what I think for the last little while. I think there is a place for both context and content. I didn't put my hand up to be on the advisory panel simply because of pressure of work, but there were 150 good souls who did. And I wish them well in that exercise. I am encouraged by the fact there are such lengthy and well-constructed consultation processes, and I encourage you to take part in those. They can exist in the same universe, content and context. We can exist in the same universe as design and technologies, and I hope no home economics ladies are waiting for me on the way to the airport. But these are things we need to work out, and I think we can do it. I have great hope for all of this. So, in the last couple of minutes, I've got about 10 minutes to go. Are there any questions? It's a dangerous woman who asks for questions on something as this. No? Any comments? Anyone want to contradict anything I've said or add to it? Because this is a space that the caveat at the start that I didn't really know what I was on about was quite genuine. Yes, sir, in the front row.
I'm wondering, because you're talking about the year 11, 12, and the need to focus on technology there, and my feeling, and it could be certainly misguided, is that there's just, we'll let 11 and 12 sit for a while because it's so contentious in the other KLAs. Is there going to be movement in there?
What we've heard in Queensland, our Queensland Studies Authority has recently released, as recently as last week, released a document they're calling The Landscape of Senior Schooling, which is quite poetic, I thought, the landscape of senior schooling. And in it, they've mapped all the existing year 11, 12 subjects to where they imagine they will sit in the Australian curriculum. And what they've got at that point seems to be quite clear, that our information technology systems and information processing and technology point to something called information communications with another S, it picked it up along the way, technologies, it picked another S up along the way, and the subjects that typically sit in sort of the design and technology space were pointing at something called design and technology, as if in senior they became discrete. But then having said that, the arrangement seems to be that the states are going to have a fair leeway in running conducting subjects of their own. And the caveat is if the title is the same or the content doesn't overlap, you're allowed to do it. Initially it was just the title. So if there's going to be, English, there's going to be an Australian curriculum English. Each state is not then permitted to run a subject called English. I know in Queensland we've got subjects like studies of religion and so on that will never appear in an Australian curriculum, so the state's retaining the right to continue to teach those subjects, and in some faith-based schools that's a compulsory subject. So there will be some leeway within the states, but I think that area is being looked at, and it's certainly, I know that we're going to see the Year 11, 12 components of the first iteration of the learning areas of Phase 1 later this year. That's been delayed, so maybe that's what you were getting at and it put back, because when you start talking in that space, you've got to start addressing the different assessment schedules we've got across the country. And I know in Queensland we're reluctant to lose our school-based assessment program, but again, that's a conversation for another day, I guess.
Thanks.
We done? Very, very good. We just go back to the start. As I said, this is up online. If you go to Prezi, .com and search for ICT in the Australian curriculum, you will find it and you can download it.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret. As always, your presentations are full of interesting facts, some great assessment of what the major concepts are, and presented in a way that we can quickly engage with. And I really thank you for that, and the audience care to join me. Thank you.